All right, we're going to start now the fifth parak, Daf Nun Amud Aleph, the Mishnah. Rav Gamliel Omer Ein Get Achar Get. Let's say, for example, Reuven was married to two wives, and he died, and he left these two Yevamos to his brother Shimon. Now Shimon gave a get to one Yevama, and then he gave a get to the other Yevama. That's one case of Ein Get the Achar Get. Another case would be that there were two brothers besides Reuven, and one of these two brothers, we'll call him Shimon, gave a get to the Yevama, and then the other Yavam gave a get to the same Yevama. So in both of these cases, Rabbi Gamliel holds that Ein Nesinas Haget Hasheni Nechsheves Maisa Gerushin. We disqualify, we discount the second get, which means that normally Gerushin would generate an Isur on the Yevama and her relatives regarding the Yavam. So if there was one Yavam and two Yevamos, the second one, Lo Nesra Shnia, Ukrovosel Ola, because the second get is not recognized, not valid. Which would mean that she can marry a Kohen. She's not called a Grusha, because the get is not a valid get. If there were two Yevamim, Shimon and Levi, there's only one Yevama, which was the second case that we mentioned earlier. The second Yavam does not become Asura Bikrovos Ha Yevama. In other words, the second Yavam, we called him Levi, is allowed to marry relatives of the Yevama, meaning of that Yevama that he gave a get to, because it's not considered Grushaso, and therefore, since the get is not valid, he's not Asur Bikrovas Grushaso. Now we go on. Vilomoil Maimar Achar Maimar. This is another principle which is almost identical to the first of Rav Gamliel, that one Maimar is not, or shall we say, blocks the viability and the halachic significance of the second Maimar. So let's say in the following two examples, let's say there's one Yavam, and he did a Maimar in one Yevama, and then he did a Maimar in the second Yevama. So that's one Yavam with two Yevamos. Or, alternatively, when there are two Yevamim, one Yavam gave Maimar to one Yevama, and the second brother again gave Maimar to the same Yevama. And we're going to apply the principle of Ein Maimar Achar Maimar. Now he offers in the Masechet a hezber here to Rav Gamliel, whether in the case of Ein Get Lachar Get or Ein Maimar Achar Maimar, with a Mimonev Shach. So we'll mention it quickly. So what's the Mimonev Shach? Let's say in the case of Get Lachar Get, if the get was effective in undermining the Zika, then with the first get, the Zika was removed, even for vis-a-vis the Shnia. And if, on the other hand, the get is not effective to be doche the Zika, then the get Sheni also is not doche, is not effective to be doche the Zika Sayyibim. And therefore, the second get, its Nesina is not meaningful. And the same iman of shach we could apply in the case of chalitza achar chalitza. I'm sorry, in the case of maimer achar maimer. If the first maimer was kona, then the second maimer, then the zika is already poka, and there's no meaning to the second maimer. And if the first maimer is not kona, and it doesn't make the Yevamot into his wife, into Ishto, then even the Maimer Sheni is not kona, and therefore it doesn't generate an Isser on the Krovos. And we go on. Velo be'ila achar be'ila. If, let's say, there was one be'ila, one yibum that was done, kil chasa, then another bia is considered a bias nus. And it doesn't matter whether or not there was one yavam who is boel both yavamos, meaning the first yavam and then hatzara. That second bila is called a bilas nus. Or alternatively, if there are two yavamim and one yavam was boel the yavama, one yavama, and the second yavam was boel the second tzara. And velo chalitza achar chalitza. And if, let's say, for example, the first chalitza was done kihil chasa, or if, let's say, the first chalitza was implemented after a get or after a maimar, which is called a chalitza psula, we'll get to that later. And let's say, for example, there was one yavam, and he was choletz one yavama, and then he went back and he was choletz the second yavama, or there was one yavam, and he was choletz the yavama, and then his brother, the other yavam, also gave her chalitza. In all these cases, we apply Rabbi Gamliel's principle that ein get achar get, ein maimar achar maimar, ein bila achar bila, ein chalitza achar chalitza. And now we get to the dissenting view of the Chacham. Chachamim omrim yesh get achar get, and v'yesh maimar achar maimar. So what happens is, according to the Chachamim, yesh get achar get means that the get is not docha the zika legamri. There still is a mixas zika left over, and therefore the get sheni is actually effective to be docha another, shall we say, another segment that was left over of the zika, and therefore the second get is going to be oser, is going to generate an iser on the megaresh with regard to the krovos hamiskareshes. And so too, there is a validity to yesh maimer achar maimer, because maimer is not a kinyan legamre, and it doesn't remove the zika. It doesn't remove the zika completely, and therefore there's room for another maimer on the mixed zika that's left over. Therefore, the second maimer is kona, and that applies whether it's one yavam who does a maimer to the yavama, and then he gives a maimer to the second yavama, meaning tatzara, or if he does a maimer in one yavama, and then his brother does a maimer in that same yavama. Aval, in what cases do the Chachamim concede to Rabbi Gamliel that the second is meaningless? And that is lo achar be'ila, lo achar chalitza. If the first was done kihil chasa, or it was done after a get or a maimar, klum. Whatever, we're talking about four possible pa'ulos. Any of those four pa'ulos are going to be ineffective. Once a be'ilu is done or a chalitza is done, none of the other four maisim will be effective. And it doesn't matter whether it was done from the bowl or the choletz, or it was done implemented from another yavam. That second maisa is not effective, even according to the Chacham of Gamliel. And the reason is because in these cases, the Zika is completely removed, either through Be'ila or through Chalitza. And anything that happens besides that is going to be meaningless, because the Zika is Betela Ligamre. He writes, "Kevan Zika poka bebeila ubechalita al kain liachar shecholetz obal yivama achas ein get hanitan litzarasa oser es krovosea ala megarish v'chein maimar obia shenase b'tzara zu eino oser osan olav." So again, all this is based on the principle that the Zika is betela legamre with the first Maisa in the cases of Be'ila and Chalitza. Now the Mishnah goes on, having presented already the Machlokas Shin Rav Gamliel and Chachamim. What's the din if the two Maisim are done in a Yevama, 2 out of the 4 Kinyanim, and he starts Mitchila and he does one Mais, and afterwards he does one of the other 3 Maisim, or Kinyanim, if you want to call that. And the Mishnah now opens up with the din of Yavam Echad, who does 2 Maisim with 1 Yavam. And it always goes through the Seder of Maimar, Get, Chalitza, and Be'ila. Ketzat. So you have 1 Yavama, and she's Kuka to 1 Yavam. And when the Yavam does one of 2 Maisim, she becomes Muteres Lashuk. So let's say Asa Maimer B'Yivimto V'Nasan Laget. The Yavam did 2 Maisim. First he starts with Maimar, then he gives her a get. Now it's interesting because in this case he didn't explicitly say that his interest in the get was to be mafkia the Zika. Or let's say it maybe a little bit more clearly and sharply. When he gave her, after the Maimar get, he did not explicitly declare that his kavana, his intention was to remove the Maimar, the Kinyan Maimar. So in such a case, number one, he has already precluded, by virtue of the get, the possibility of his being miyabim. Normally, after Maimar, he could be miyabim. The yibum is a follow-up and almost the next stage beyond Maimar. But here in this case, following up his Maimar with a get, the Chacham were mitaken that this get is now doche the zikas yibum. Again, it's all drabana. And therefore, he can no longer be miyabim the Yevama that he gave Maimar to originally. Because after the get, there's an isolav, like after Chalitza, of Kevan Shalabana Shuvlo Yivna. But now this get is not mafkia zikas yibum in Torah, and therefore she needs Chalitza. Tzricha imenu Chalitza. It's not enough that he gives her a get. Now we have another scenario of also Maimar and then Vechalitza. Instead of following up with a get, he follows up with Chalitza. The Chalitza is mafkir the zikas yibum min Torah, but nevertheless she needs a get min Rabbanan because by virtue of the Maimar. Because the Rabbanan were misaking that kiddushin of Maimar require a get. Another scenario, also Maimar Ubal. After Maimar, he was Boel. That's perfect. Arei Zukim Mitzvasa. He was Makabim the mitzvah of Yibum in a perfect way. Now we have a different scenario. Nasan get, he starts by giving a get to his Yevama, and then the Asa Maimar, which again, Midrabanan, we recognize as Kiddushin. There's no possibility of Yibum because he started by giving her a get. He was Doche, the Zika, by virtue of the get. However, the maimar is kone, and therefore she needs both get and chalitza. Get limamoro v'chalitza to be mafkia the zika sibum and to be mater holishuk. Another scenario, nasan get ubal. He starts with a get, and then illegitimately he was boel her. Now we're not going to allow him to be miyabim her and maintain that relationship because he was mafkir the zika with the get midrabanan. On a Torah level, on the other hand, his bia is bia, and she's a kukalo, and the zika is not paka. The fact that he gave her get on a doraisa level is meaningless, and therefore tzricha get vichalitza. She needs a get to remove the ishus that's created by the be'ilah, by the yibum, because minatora that yibum is valid. On the other hand, she now also needs chalitza, and that's on a drabanan level. And why is that? Because we say that the be'ilah is a be'ilah psula. As we said, it was illegitimate. He had no right to follow up the get with be'ilah. And therefore, on a drabanan level, we say that that be'ilah, which is called the be'ilah psula, does not remove the zika when it was implemented after a get. Hence, she still needs chalitza to remove the zika. Another scenario, nasan get v'chalatz. He opens up by giving a get to his yevama, and then instead of being boel her, he does chalitza. And here we have a principle called ein achar chalitza klum, which means the chalitza removes the zika completely. Whatever was left over, the shirayim of the get, meaning the get was not completely mafkia zika. Now the chalitza removes the zika, whatever's left of the zika. Now this chalitza is called the chalitza psula. Chalitza psula means whatever he doesn't have an option of yibum. In this case, he has no option of yibum because he started by giving a get. So the Rabbanan didn't say that, he's not mafkir the zika completely. Therefore, in a case where, let's say, subsequent to the get chalitza sequence, he would do a maimar or a bia, then we would say the following. We have a principle of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva's principle is that ein kedushin tovsim b'chayvei lav. Once he has implemented a chalitza, now the chalitza becomes asura ala yavam midin lav, because came into labana shuv lo yivne. And Rabbi Akiva holds that if now he would be makadisher, then that mimer could not be chal because ein kedushin tovsim b'chayvei lav. So the good news is that after chalitza, if he did a mimer, she would not require a get to remove that mimer because the mimer is not tofes. Now let's say instead of mimer he does bia. Once again, with that bia, he is violating an isur lav of lo yivne and ein kedushin tovsim b'chayvei lavim according to Rabbi Akiva. Now the Mishnah continues to explain and clarify the din of a yavam who started with chalitza and then he did one of the other three kinyanim. Also the din of a yavam who is boel, and then after he did one of the three kinyanim. Chalatz. He started with a chalitza to the yavama. That's a chalitza doraisa mitzvah gemura. The achar kain asa maimer nasan get o baal, any of those three. Or alternatively, he started with be'ilah, which is perfect, and then follows with asa b'maimar or nasan get or chalatz. Ein achar chalitza klum and ein achar be'ilah klum. The chalitza that was done initially was mafkir the zika completely, and therefore the maimer, the bia afterwards is meaningless. It's not a kinyan at all. So too, if he started with Just 1 second. Started with Bia. Completely removes the Zika. She's an Eishes Ish. He writes here, Afim Asa Osam L'Shem Kedushay Torah, even if after Chalitza, he would be Makadisha for Kedushay Torah, Lo Kana. Mishum Shasura ala Yavam V'lav, Yein Kedushay Tosu Chavilav L'Reka Rekiva. So if he gives her a get after Chalitza, it's not meaningless, it's not effective, because he was mafkir the Zika through Chalitza. So it's like giving a get to a woman who's not even married to you. And so too, as we said earlier, if he was Boel Tchila and he was Konaf with Ishus and she's Ishto Gemura, the Zika is gone, then a Chalitza afterwards would not be meaningful to be Matir Halashuk. She needs a get. Oh, now if he gave her a get afterwards, that get would be matir her without chalitza, because now she's an Eishes through the Be'ila. Not only that, let's say he wants to remarry her afterwards. So in a case of a Yevamo that he gave her a get, he's not allowed to be miyabim her afterwards once he gave her a get. But in this case, that he started with Be'ila, then if he gave her a get, he's allowed to remarry her with the man who's machzir gushasa, as long as she wasn't married to someone else in the meantime. Now, let's say if the Be'ili does a mimer, that mimer is not kohen. It's meaningless. He's already married to her from the moment of Be'ila. So that's the part of the Mishnah that's on Daf Nun Amid Aleph, and now we go on to Daf Nun Amid Beis.